Hello. I'm going to read an extract from my novel, The Painter of Bridges, which is set during the Siege of Sarajevo and narrated by a painter. The Intruders. It was a couple of weeks before war broke out, and the streets of Sarajevo were filling with strange faces. Coarse, ugly faces that did not fit. I pulled my coat tighter and hurried through town on my way to the studio. As I walked, I heard the harsh peasant dialects of mountain villages and the slang of the streets and the prisons. A rumour was spreading that all the criminals had been released from jail to defend the city against the troops gathering in the hills, people were saying. There was a looseness in the atmosphere. Deutschmarks flashed everywhere. A phone call. My wife, Sonia, answered it and turned pale. That was Gordana, she said. A family of bandits has broken into Mum's flat. She's called the police, but they refuse to leave. Grab your coat, we must go at once. My mother-in-law had been living with us since the previous autumn. She was 89, ill and frail, hardly able to dress or feed herself. Her apartment, Sonia's childhood home, was in a good mansion block on a tree-lined street in old Sarajevo. It was full of fine books and antique furniture. My insides tightened at the thought of strangers being there, fingering the beautiful objects. We pulled on our coats and caught the tram across town in silence. It must have been late March, but it was still as cold as winter. The cherry trees along the Miljatska were holding back their blossom in tight white fists, and the river was a churned-up brown, swollen with rain and melted snow. Sleet slapped our faces as we got off the tram and run down our necks in icy trickles. By the time we stood outside my mother-in-law's flat, we were cold and soaking, stones of dread in our stomach. We were not young, we had never been fighters. I rang the bell. A bored-looking policeman answered, toothpick jutting from his mouth. Without taking it out or saying a word, he cocked his head to one side to direct us through to the living room. He did not step aside. Sonia gripped my arm as we pushed past him. In the living room of my mother-in-law's flat, two tall men in their 20s were lounging on dining chairs. A fire had been lit in the stove, and the younger of the two was leaning over to prod it with a poker. The other had his back to us and was rocking on his chair, his feet kicked up on my mother-in-law's velvet sofa. Sitting plumb in the middle of the sofa was a large-chested woman in her 50s or thereabouts. Her black hair was pulled up into a high bun, and she had a spot of rouge on each cheek. She was so short that her feet did not touch the floor, but she sat up straight-backed and regal as Queen Sissi of Hungary. Sonia and I stared at the intruders, ice melting into our coats. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice higher than usual. The man with his back to us swiveled his head round and sneered. He looked like a tiger. He had a flat face, a square jaw, and an intense orange hue to his skin. His eyes flashed arrogantly. We found out later that he had just been released from jail. "We've moved in," the short woman stated. "But this is my mother's flat," I said. "You can't just move in." "We can, if the flat's deserted," the woman said slowly. "Or the owner dead." "What?" I asked in confusion. She reached forwards to drag a finger across the coffee table. "Look at the dust in this place," she said. "No one's lived here for months, years even. This is the flat of a dead woman, I know it." "My mother's alive," Sonia burst in. "She's living with us right now." A smile as smug as a camel's appeared on Queen Sissi's lips. "She's dead." "She's not." "Well, my dear, we're not going anywhere till you bring her to us." We went outside to ask the policeman for help, but he shrugged and looked blank-faced. Furious, we hurried to the nearest police station to file a report. No one seemed interested. There was a feeling of waiting, of killing time there. Finally, a policeman looked up from the game of cards he was playing. "Look," he said, "the rich are all leaving the city, getting out while they can. The council said all empty flats are up for grabs." "But that's absurd," I said. "We have the deeds in a drawer somewhere. Surely you can do something." "Like what?" the policeman said. "No one's in charge here." He slapped the chest of his national police uniform. "And who knows how much longer we'll be wearing these for?" The only course of action, it seemed, was to go home and take my mother-in-law to the flat. She had not been outside the whole winter and was alarmed when Sonia tried to squeeze her feet into her shoes. She thought we were trying to get rid of her. "Why must I go to my flat?" she kept saying. "Don't you want me here?" It was dark when we got there. The intruders seemed not to have moved at all, other than to draw the curtains, light the lamps, and help themselves to large tumblers of whisky. The open stove threw a circle of flickering orange light over them. "Who are they?" my mother-in-law gasped, taking a shaky step forwards to peer short-sightedly at the trio. The three intruders had frozen as if they had seen an aunt returned from the dead. The colour drained from Queen Sissy's face, leaving the 2 red dots of rouge glowing like embers on her cheeks. Her sons turned to her, a twitch working under Tiger Face's right eye. "Who are they?" my mother-in-law repeated, her voice quivering. The large-chested woman scowled and, jumping down from the sofa, pushed past my mother-in-law and came up to Sonia and me. She was barely taller than a child, but her sons got up at the same time and stood behind her, flanking her like giant playground bullies. "All right," she said grandly, as if granting us a favour. "All right. We'll leave now." It took less than 5 minutes for them to gather their bags and jackets. The woman nodded to her elder son, and he scooped up several bottles of whiskey, vodka and Slivovitz from the drinks cabinet. As they were leaving, she turned to Sonia and said with a leer, alcohol hot on her breath, "Just remember this, my dear. Your mother's flat is not safe. Don't think it will stay empty. Other people who come, and they will come, they won't leave so easily." My mother-in-law crossed over to the sofa and perched down on its edge. Sonia and I stood uncertainly in the centre of the room, staring out of the front door that had just been left open. That was our first sign of the anarchy and chaos that lay around the corner.